Hey there folks, the Evening Jukebox here with another entry in my Rock Hall Reviews series for 2025. What is the Rock Hall Review series, you may be asking? It's a yearly series that I do on this channel where I talk about one album from each of the current year's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame nominees, review it, and then talk about if I think they deserve to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and if I think they will get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Two questions that very frequently have different answers, more so than you might expect. And today, I am kind of talking about two bands at the same time. I'm reviewing Technique by New Order, but in terms of Rock Hall nomination, I'm talking about Joy Division / New Order, as they've been nominated together. But for review purposes, New Order, Technique, 1989, here you go. It is a legendary, mythologicized tale at this point, but for those who are not familiar somehow, New Order began as not New Order, all the way back with Ian Curtis in 1976 as Joy Division, who released Unknown Pleasures and Closer, two of the most influential albums of any genre of their era, with the former's cover art probably being on just as many t-shirts in your local Hot Topic as it has as many overpriced copies on vinyl at your local record store. Truly, two of the most iconic albums of all time, two of the most acclaimed records of all time. And then after the tragic passing of Curtis in 1980 after he took his own life, the remaining band members regrouped with Gillian Gilbert and initially started out as a post-punk band that was honestly not that unlike what a third Joy Division album probably would have sounded like. But they quickly ended up leaning into the world of synth pop and really never stopped after a couple records, just kind of kept going in that more pop-oriented direction. And just a few albums later, they were just full-on electronic pop artists through and through, and Technique, in my eyes, may be the exact moment, not only where New Order undeniably became something entirely unattached from what Joy Division once represented, but also they kind of began to master their own sound here. I really do feel like this is not only the pinnacle of New Order, but the pinnacle of all artists involved general careers, and maybe even one of the best moments of the entirety of pop music in the 80s. Truly a phenomenal album. This is just an absolutely stunning album. I mean, musically speaking, the synths here just haven't really aged a day, in my opinion at least, which is kind of crazy because there are New Order albums released after this that I would argue have actually aged worse than this one. Not to say that there are any really horrible New Order albums, but you get my point. I just think this album, Technique, sounds absolutely magical. Every single note, every single embellishment feels purposeful and filled with intent, and with the ever underappreciated Gillian Gilbert directing a lot of that synth work, it just sounds gorgeous here. And that isn't to mention those underlying bass lines from the legendary Peter Hook, arguably, in my eyes at least, one of the all-time great bassists just across the board, with his bass lines bringing a certain funkiness to the record that never feels overwhelming, but definitely gives Technique this kind of punch that perfectly punctuates songs like Mr. Disco and Guilty Partner, for example, and the more airy atmospheres that they bring to the table that definitely needed some weight that his bass lines do ultimately provide to them. And I also think it's worth bringing up Bernard Sumner as well, who I think is a pretty terribly underappreciated frontman overall. I mean, sure, he doesn't have any sort of angelic godsend voice in the way that certain other vocalists of the era did, nor does he have the sort of hopeless poet kind of vocal style that you would have expected from his predecessor in Joy Division, Ian Curtis. But at the same time, I've always felt that his kind of casual personality behind the mic grounded New Order really nicely and prevented them from coming across as too self-indulgent with their electronic influences, and made them all around feel more human. And I just feel like when I listen to tracks like Vanishing Point and All the Way, I feel that he sort of nearly has the same pastel gothic vocal presence on this record that I think is at least somewhat fair to compare to The Cure's very early work, not necessarily the really gothic stuff, but the more like super young Robert Smith Boys Don't Cry kind of era, singing over the kind of instrumentals that the UK and the UK electronic music scene specifically would pretty much just be expanding upon for like the next 15, 20 years or so. I mean, this album's impact and legacy is absolutely massive, and you know what, you could say the same about a few albums in New Order's discography, to say the least, about their impact and influence. And that brings me to the thing that honestly amazes me the most about Technique, the sheer influence that it has had. I mean, sure, there are a couple other New Order albums that are more popular or commercially successful than this album, respectively, but I think that despite that being pretty objective, there is an argument to be made, at least for me, that this is their most influential and seminal work overall. I know a lot of people will probably pick some of the albums that preceded this record over Technique, but I don't know. I mean, listen to this and try and tell me that half of Europe's electronic music scene throughout the 90s and the early 2000s weren't trying to recreate what they brought to the table here. I mean, whether you look towards 90s electronic artists like the Future Sound of London, or even 2000s pop artists like Robyn with her iconic Dancing on My Own, I really do feel like countless musicians wanted to embody Technique and its soundscapes and everything that it represented creatively, that emotion, that nostalgia, but that futuristic, deeply electronic and non-human, but still emotionally striking feeling, you know? And while, sure, maybe some did it better, and in more experimental or more boundary-pushing ways than what Technique represents, though that isn't really common considering this record really did push the boundary for electronic pop in 1989. I don't necessarily know if anyone ever really came to the sheer consistency and futuristic charm of this record. I not only consider this the best New Order album, but if we're going by what the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is nominating them as, this is somewhat of a hot take, I suppose, but I would consider this the best Joy Division / New Order record. I love Unknown Pleasures and Closer and Power, Corruption, and Lies as much as the next person who can appreciate post-punk and more gothic-oriented stuff, but I don't know, this one just really strikes an emotional chord with me and remains not only my favorite of those two bands put together's discographies, but also just one of my favorite electronic and pop albums of the entire 1980s, with New Order really ending off the decade with a serious bang here. Maybe I'm only saying this because when I'm in the right mood, this album could nearly make me cry because of how beautifully it's produced, but I'm going to give this album 4.5 stars out of 5. Now, do I think that Joy Division and New Order deserve to get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? Do you think I'm stupid? Yes, absolutely. They're one of the most influential bands of all time. If you even just slice it down the middle and consider Joy Division and New Order entirely separate entities, which, to clarify, the Rock Hall isn't, but even if you did, they're still two of the most influential bands of all time. They changed music permanently. Some of the most iconic songs, some of the most iconic imagery in the history of popular music, and despite neither of them being like the most commercially successful or quote-unquote mainstream bands of all time, their cultural impact is extraordinary. Maybe in the top 5% of artists throughout modern history, throughout the 20th century. The impact that they've had is insane. Modern alternative music would not be what it is today without Joy Division and New Order, and I can guarantee you, if you go onto TikTok or Instagram Reels right now and scroll through shit that's tagged with alternative or indie, you'll hear 500 artists trying to be one of those two bands, Joy Division or New Order, and doing the worst job in the world at it, but they're still trying, and that's the impact that I'm talking about. Whether you want to look at something as simple as how many Unknown Pleasures shirts there are out there, or how many bands were actually directly impacted by Joy Division / New Order, the impact is immense, and there's no denying it. And yes, they should be inducted. They should have been inducted 20 years ago. But you know what? Better late than never, I guess. Kind of, ish. Now, do I think they're going to get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame this year? In a just world, they are the first pick, honestly. I mean, they are arguably either the #1 most influential artist on the list this year, or tied for first place with Outkast for the most influential artist on the list this year. And you know what? That in and of itself should just make me be able to say, you know what? Yes, they're going to get in. They are. That being said, I feel like they won't. Not to be negative, not to rain on anybody's parade or anything, because I know a lot of people are rooting for them to get in, but I don't know, man. As it stands, they just aren't the kind of band that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame tends to go for. I mean, if you look at the list this year, artists like Bad Company, Billy Idol, Joe Cocker are more likely to be recognized by the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame because those are artists that still get played on classic rock radio and appeal to the kind of boomer audience that really does support the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame the majority of the time. Now, I'm not saying that the Rock Hall never recognizes in any capacity less popular musicians, but at the same time, most of that's like A Tribe Called Quest, or, Kate Bush, artists who are so critically acclaimed and still household names in one way or another that there's still no denying them, and people would probably get out into the streets and riot if they were just completely dismissed for decades on end and never really honored in any way. And I do think that is the case with Joy Division / New Order. There's no doubt in my mind they will eventually get in, but I just don't think it's going to be this year. This is their second nomination, for those that don't know, and if you were even remotely familiar with a lot of artists that Joy Division had influenced eventually, who are already inducted, they took a few nominations. The Cure took a couple, despite being one of the most commercially successful bands of all time within the realm of gothic music, arguably the most successful of all time. Depeche Mode took 3 nominations before they got in, and they have arguably one of the most iconic albums of the entirety of the 90s with Violator, so on and so forth. My point is that there are bands that are considered equal to Joy Division / New Order in terms of cultural impact, and arguably bigger than them in terms of just pure record sales and iconic imagery, not music, but just imagery, that took multiple nominations, 2 to 4 nominations to get in, and Joy Division are only on their second. So between that and the fact that this ballot is kind of stacked with a lot of classic rock fodder that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame loves to honor for some reason, bands like Bad Company and the Black Crowes, I don't see it this year. It would be nice if they did, because they could finally move on to another alternative artist to, nominate like 4 times before people are finally like, just do it and induct them. Maybe after this we could finally get Devo in. Maybe we could finally try for the Pixies or Sonic Youth. The Replacements were nominated one time. I mean, I'm starting to list bands that have nothing to even remotely do with Joy Division / New Order, but really my point just is that I think that Joy Division and New Order, despite being as massive and culturally important for music and the music industry at large, having literal murals up for the late Ian Curtis out there, I just don't think they're the type of band the Rock Hall inducts, so I don't think that they're going to get it this year. If they don't, 3rd or 4th nomination, absolutely. No chance that they don't at that point. I would be shocked if they didn't, but I don't know, it just feels like it's a bit early. In a just world, this had already happened before I was even born, but you know what, now I don't think it's gonna happen, so no, probably not, unless they induct 8 artists again this year. Then maybe, but as it stands, no. And with that being said, that is the end of this entry in my Rock Hall review series for 2025. Thank you for watching The Infinite Jukebox, and I will see you in the next one.